Hey there everybody, welcome to what will be another rock and roll history episode of my vlog. Today I'm going to talk about famous Canadian rock band April Wine. For those of you who are from the States, you may or may not know about them. They had a few hits in the States, but they were mostly popular in Canada. I'd like to do a video at some point about the MAPL regulations, Canadian content regulations on radio, because they allowed for a lot of Canadian bands to get a local following that probably otherwise wouldn't have been able to. And April Wine was awesome. In fact, they still are awesome. 51 years after they were founded back in 1969, they are still going strong. And even though they've had such a long history, it's not been particularly stable. This is a band that's gone through a lot of changes over the years, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that. So they were founded, I believe, pretty much right out of high school in Halifax, Nova Scotia. 1969. The original lineup was Miles Goodwin on guitar and vocals. Miles Goodwin is the only guy who's been with April Wine since the very beginning. And then the other three members were the three Henman brothers. These were Jim Henman on the bass guitar, David on electric guitar, and Richie on the drums. And that was the original lineup, and that's the album that signed. That's the lineup rather that signed the deal with Aquarius Records and put out a debut album in 1971. That album had a song on it called "Fast Train" that was marginally successful, not a huge hit. But did well enough for their record label to be happy with them, and well enough for them to sort of get a little taste of success. But pretty much right off the bat, after that first album, they had their first lineup change when Jim Henman, the bassist, decided to quit. They wound up replacing him with Jim Clench. Jim Clench is awesome, one of the great Canadian bassists of all time, played in many different bands. Like BTO and even Loverboy for a while, but he's perhaps most known for his time in April Wine. The first album with this lineup was on record. I always thought this was cool how the actual record itself is just on the front cover. It's kind of weird. So this album came out in 1972, and this was quite a success for them. I always kind of felt bad for them because there's a lot of great original songs on this. Like Drop Your Guns, which was a minor hit, but the two biggest hits on this album for them were the songs You Could Have Been a Lady and Bad Side of the Moon. You Could Have Been a Lady is a Hot Chocolate song, and Bad Side of the Moon is an Elton John song. And it's funny to me that the two covers they decided to do are what become the hits. I wonder if that discourages you as a songwriter. So they did some traveling with that. They pretty much never stopped touring April Wine. And then went in the studio to record a third album. But midway through the recording sessions for their next album in 1973, both the remaining Henman brothers, being David and Richie, dropped out. They said, "We quit." And so that left the band with just Jim Clench and Miles Goodwin. And that meant now, only 4 years into their history, Miles Goodwin is already the only original member left. But they decided to continue the band. It was actually quite a discussion on whether they should even keep trying at all. But they were having fun. They saw big things in the future, and they were halfway through recording an album, so they decided to hire some new members. And these new members would both become longtime members of the band. They were Jerry Mercer on the drums, just one of the all-time greats, Canadian drummers, and then Gary Moffat on the lead guitar. And that lineup stayed together for quite a while and finished off the recording of what would become the Electric Jewels album. No big Canadian radio hit on this. Weeping Widow is on there though. That's a fan favorite. They still play sometimes. But not a lot of the big hit type stuff on here, but it's still a good album. And then they did a whole tour for that, and then I guess some members of the Young Rascals were in the audience one night when they were performing and said, "You guys should do a live album, we'll produce it for you." And they were like, "Okay." And then out came April Wine Live in 1974, super early live album for them. Pretty fun. April Wine put out a few live albums in their time. and they're all great. April Wine was always a great live band. Then in 1975, they recorded and released my favorite April Wine album of all time, one of my favorite Canadian rock albums of all time. This is Stand Back. 3 songs from this album are still played just constantly on Canadian radio. These are Ooh What a Night, which is sung by bassist Jim Clench, I Wouldn't Want to Lose Your Love, and probably the biggest hit on this album, Tonight is a Wonderful Time to Fall in Love. Those last 2 ballads are sung by Miles Goodwin. Most of April Wine's hits were sung by Miles. Great live shot in there. But yeah, Jim Clench sang lead on Ooh What a Night, and didn't get a chance to sing it live with the group that many times because on the tour for the Stand Back album, he left after 4 years, and it was yet another lineup change for April Wine. They replaced him with bassist Steve Lang and kept on trucking. In 1976, they put out the album The Whole World's Going Crazy. Probably the biggest hit from that album was the ballad Like a Lover, Like a Song. Not a huge hit, but popular on Canadian radio. And then the following year, in 1977, they put out Forever for Now. This is not my favorite April Wine album, personally, but it does have the huge hit song, You Won't Dance With Me. And again, I say huge hit, but again, if you're south of the border, you probably don't know those songs. Unless you do, let me know in the comments if you're an American and you know these tunes. Then on the tour for this album, they did some, the Rolling Stones did some kind of secret club gigs at this place called the El Macambo in Toronto. And they got Canadian rock band April Wine to open up for them. And I think both bands wound up with live releases from those concerts. And one of them, of course, April Wine's Live at the El Macambo. This album is awesome. This album is, if I recall correctly, well, I guess I can check, can't I? I do believe it was produced by Eddie Kramer. Yeah, produced and engineered by Eddie Kramer, one of the greatest live producers of all time. He did all the sound at Woodstock. He worked on some of Jimi Hendrix and I believe Led Zeppelin's early stuff. And then, of course, the Kiss Alive series of albums that I love so much. But yeah, that's his work on producing the great April Wine Live at the El Macambo. I really love the song Juvenile Delinquent from this album, and they do a really great live version of Don't Push Me Around too. I like that song too. Later on that year, in 1977, yet another lineup change, but this one's all positive because they just added a new member. They added a 3rd guitarist in Brian Greenway. Now they had 3 guitarists playing off of each other. Sounds excessive, but it was not. It created some really cool dynamics with where two guitarists can solo off each other and there's still a rhythm guy in the background. And yeah, so this kind of became what is sort of known as April Wine's classic lineup, their famous lineup. So yeah, you got Miles Goodwin singing lead and playing guitar, Brian Greenwell also playing guitar, and Gary Moffat also playing guitar, and then you got Steve Lang on the bass and Jerry Mercer on the drums. And their first album with this lineup was First Glance. This is the Canadian cover of it. It has a completely different front cover in the United States. And this was the first album in which they got any sort of crossover American success. The song Roller was a pretty big hit. She's a roller, yeah, I won't be. That song was a big hit. Well, at least I think it was a top 40 song in the United States, which was big for them, allowed them to do some U.S. concerts. And, of course, a big hit in Canada, too. Rock and Roll is a Vicious Game is a big song off this album as well. Good stuff there. Then, one of my favorites, the following year in 1979, they put out the Harder, Faster album. They call it that because they were trying to, make their sound a little harder edge, and they wrote some good tunes. My favorite April Wine song as a kid is on this album, and that was I Like to Rock. I thought it was such a cool song just because it's a party rock song in which they include little parts of the Beatles' Day Tripper, and then of course Satisfaction from the Rolling Stones. Also, Say Hello has got such a cool groove. It's a rock song in 3/4 with a really cool drum groove from Jerry Mercer. Ladies Man is on this album. and a cool cover of King Crimson's 21st Century Schizoid Man. That's very cool. Then no album released in 1980, just a whole lot of touring and recording, and then in early 1981, the Nature of the Beast comes out. This is probably their biggest selling album of all time, I think. I know it was their biggest hit album in the United States. Possibly the biggest hit on the album was their ballad Just Between You and Me, but I hear Sign of the Gypsy Queen on Sirius Radio a lot, and Sirius is of course a United States based radio. I always love when they play some April Wine on US stations. Big City Girls is on this, All Over Town is on this, just some great tunes. Yeah, big huge hit. They did some international touring for this album, including in Europe. Yes, and then they returned to the studio in '82 to record yet another album, Power Play. This was their last really huge hit album, which had the this album has two songs that you hear on Canadian radio all the time. There's probably about 20 April Wine songs that get airplay in radio in Canada, like consistently. There's a lot of April Wine on Canadian radio. Anything You Want, You Got It, and Enough Is Enough come from this album, and it's great. They did a huge 2-year tour for that album before they went back into the studio and made Animal Magnetism in 1984. Now by the time they made that album, they were really not getting along, and they really wanted to break up, but they decided to do one last tour before they did that. They did the massive Animal Magnetism world tour in 1984-85, and I do believe they did actually bill it as a farewell tour. When that tour ended, the band broke up, and Miles Goodwin moved to the Bahamas and started working on some solo projects, but they got word from Capitol Records, who was distributing their music in the United States, Aquarius was their label in Canada, that they still owed them one more album, and they had to do that in order to not violate their contract. And so Miles just took the songs he'd been working on for a solo project and basically just rebranded it as an April Wine album. Most of the actual band, the touring band for April Wine, was not involved in that album, although Brian Greenway does also play guitar on that. It was called Walking Through Fire, and it came out in 1986. I don't believe it got much. I don't believe it did very well. Again, it's one of those. I haven't actually heard the album. Maybe it's good. I don't know, but it's one of those contractual obligation albums. And then after that came out, April Wine was officially broken up. And then a couple years later, in 1988, Miles Goodwin did put out a solo album. I can't remember what it's called. His solo album was it's just self-titled, Miles Goodwin solo album for 1988. And then shortly after that, he moved away from the Bahamas, came back home to Canada, and after a few years, April Wine decided to get back together. And it was a heavily publicized thing in Canada in 1992 when April Wine decided to reunite after 6, but more like 7 or 8 years apart. And the new lineup of April Wine was pretty cool. So it did not include longtime April Wine members Gary Moffat, guitarist from 73 to when the band broke up in the mid-80s. It also did not include bassist Steve Lang, who had joined in 75. But this lineup did include Miles Goodwin, of course, Brian Greenway, also on guitars, and Jerry Mercer on the drums, and back after a long absence was Jim Clench on bass. He's the guy who sang lead on Ooh What a Night that I was telling you about, and then left shortly afterwards, bassist from 71 to 75. And now after 17 years apart from the band, he was back in. And they did a pretty successful Canadian tour in 92. And, I also almost forgot to mention, they did have a third guitarist on that tour to fill out the sound, and his name was Steve Seagal. Not that Steven Seagal, but Steve Seagal. This new lineup of the band put out 2 new albums. The first one was called Attitude in 1993, and then they put out a second album called Frigate in 1994. But shortly after the release of those two albums, that new guitarist, Steve Seagal, was let go, and the band continued on as a foursome, much the way they started their existence as a foursome. They continued that way, and they still are a four-piece group to this day. Anyway, as a four-piece band, they kept on going, kept on touring pretty much every year in Canada. In 2001, they put out another new album called Back to the Mansion. And then I believe they put out a live album shortly thereafter as well. I know there's some great live video from their 2003 tour. Yeah, that lineup, that reunited lineup, even just the four of them with Miles, Brian, Jim Clench, and Jerry Mercer is just awesome. And then in 2006, they put out one last album with that lineup that was called Roughly Speaking, and that is to this day the most recent April Wine album, as of me filming this in 2020. At the end of 2006, Jim Clench retired from the group after, I guess, a grand total of like 18 years in the band, on and off. And he wound up being replaced by bassist by the name of Breen LaBeouf. And band kept going with that lineup for a couple of years, and then 2 years later, at the end of 2008, longtime drummer Jerry Mercer retired from the group as well, and then he was replaced by a drummer by the name of Blair McKay. Sad story that the last gig that Jerry Mercer was supposed to play in the group was this New Year's Eve show. It was supposed to be his farewell show, counting down the minutes to 2009. But due to a snowstorm or something, that gig wound up being canceled, so he didn't get that big farewell show. But the lineup changes for April Wine were not over. In 2011, that new bassist I was telling you about, Breen LaBeouf, he left, and then they replaced him with a new bassist by the name of Richard Lanthier. And then Blair McKay, the drummer, left the next year in 2012 and was replaced by Roy Nip Nickel. And that's how the April Wine lineup stands to this day. You got the original Miles Goodwin. You got Brian Greenway, who joined in 1977. And then you got sort of the two new guys in Richard and Nip. I know in 2014, I believe it was, Miles Goodwin hinted, or didn't really hint, said in no uncertain terms that he was going to leave April Wine's touring group. He said that he was getting too old to do it, and he said, I'm not going to do it anymore. I remember he said that he'd continue to work with April Wine on studio projects, to what I said, what studio projects? Anyway, but he said, yeah, I'm going to leave, and we're going to hire a new singer, and they're going to be the new April Wine singer. And I was like, okay, so now you got no original lineup members. But he didn't go through with it. April Wine went out on tour in 2015, and there he was. And he kept, same in 2016 and 17, he never went through with that retirement. As of March of 2020, when COVID ruined everything, he was still touring as the lead singer of April Wine. He also he put out a solo album. Miles Goodwin put out his second solo album in 2018 called Friends of the Blues. Just him and some friends playing some blues tunes. I haven't heard that album, but I've heard good things about it. A couple of sad things to report about April Wine in the last few years. 4 years after he retired, bassist Jim Clench died in 2010, and then his replacement bassist, Steve Lang, who's played bass in April Wine from 75 to 85, also died just about 3 years ago. But as of 2020, April Wine still lives on more than 50 years after they first founded the group. The Canadian rock survives. And yeah, at some point I'd love to do a video on the Canadian radio regulations that allowed for not just April Wine, but so many Canadian bands to survive and thrive, starting in the early 70s. Yeah, that'll do it for this episode. Thank you so much for watching. Hope you enjoyed it. Again, let me know in the comments if you're an American who is aware of April Wine. Yeah, like this video if you like what you saw. Subscribe to this channel if you've been enjoying my videos, and you can ring the notification bell if you would like to be notified whenever I upload a new video. Um, and yeah, check out my description for links to where you can find my own music. I'm also a musician myself. Yeah, you can find my music where it's sold or streamed online. Thanks so much for watching. I'll catch you again with a new episode real soon.